Have you ever wondered if homosexuality only began to be discussed in modern times? What if I told you it has always been part of human history? In ancient Greece, did you know there was a famous army made up of male lovers who fought side by side? And in Rome, why did some emperors openly keep young men as partners? What about Mesopotamia, where certain temple rituals included same-sex acts? Or China, where stories were told about emperors sharing their beds with men? Were these relationships accepted? Were they a sign of power? Or were they quietly judged just like today? History doesn't always give us clear answers, but asking these questions shows us one truth. Love and desire have always been more complex than we're taught. Tell me the time you're watching this in the comments. And if you enjoy hearing history's hidden sides, subscribing is up to you. But the next stories will surprise you even more. You step into a tomb lit only by the flicker of your torch, and suddenly you pause because what's painted on the walls doesn't look like the usual solemn parade of gods and kings. Instead, there are gestures that seem almost tender figures positioned in ways that make you tilt your head and wonder were the ancients hiding stories of love that historians once brushed aside. Could it be that these quiet carvings whisper about relationships that didn't fit the rigid family tree we expect from the past? As you let your eyes adjust, the painted eyes on the plaster seem to gaze back. Two men side by side, hands overlapping, in a way that feels oddly familiar. Almost like how modern couples might pose in photographs. Only here, it's thousands of years old. Was this just artistic convention? Or was it perhaps a subtle nod to an affection too delicate to record openly? You might think of how today even a casual selfie with a friend can be misread. And then you wonder if we are making the same mistake looking backward. The Egyptians left behind walls full of symbolism, so maybe these details had nothing to do with romance at all. Maybe the clasped hands were just ritualistic, a gesture of unity for the afterlife. And yet, when you compare it to scenes of husbands and wives buried in the same chambers, the resemblance is uncanny. Why would two men be portrayed in the same way as husband and wife, unless there was some unspoken bond the artists wanted to honor? Isn't it fascinating how art can both reveal and conceal at the same time? Your torchlight drifts over another scene, priests performing ceremonies under the watchful eye of gods like Hathor and Ra. The sacred and the personal mingled constantly in this culture. Could it be that the boundaries between spiritual devotion and human intimacy blurred more than we assume? Imagine the awkwardness if centuries from now, people studied modern wedding photographs but didn't realize they were about marriage. Wouldn't that distort our entire idea of love? Here's where the mystery deepens. Archaeologists sometimes stumble on burial sites where two men are interred together in poses eerily similar to married couples. Some scholars shrug and say coincidence. Others lean in closer and whisper, but what if it's not? And isn't that the fun of history? The way it leaves you dangling, never quite certain, like standing on tiptoe to peek over a wall that's just a little too high. And let's be honest, history is rarely neat. For centuries, translators and historians often skipped past or smoothed over details that didn't fit their worldview. You can almost hear the sigh of a 19th century scholar muttering, "That must be an error," while moving quickly to the next scroll. But was it really an error? Or was it something their society wasn't ready to see? Haven't we all ignored uncomfortable evidence at some point just to keep our tidy stories intact? As you keep exploring the tomb, feels less like a dusty ruin and more like a puzzle box. Every fresco is a fragment, every hieroglyph a half-spoken sentence. Were these images meant for us at all, or only for the souls of the departed? And if we are intruding on private symbols, can we ever be sure we're reading them correctly? You wonder if the silence of the stones is deliberate, a secret agreement between the buried and the builders meant to keep outsiders guessing for eternity. It's a little ironic, isn't it? We live in a time when nearly everything is photographed, captioned, and posted for strangers. Yet even then, people misinterpret what they see. If misunderstanding is that easy, now how much harder must it be when your evidence is a chipped relief carved 4,000 years ago? Perhaps the ambiguity is the point, leaving us to question whether we're uncovering lost loves or simply projecting our own imaginations onto ancient stone. And so, you wander deeper, hearing echoes in the silence. The question hangs in the air like dust motes catching the light. Were the ancients quietly recording lives that did not fit the mold? Or are we just searching for reflections of ourselves in their art? You linger on the thought of tomb art, and then your steps guide you into another chamber where the names Niankuknum and Khnumhotep are etched. Here lies one of the most puzzling cases in all of Egyptian archaeology. Two men of high standing, buried together in a mastaba at Saqqara, their images carved in poses strikingly similar to those of married couples. Was this just coincidence? Or was it a deliberate message to anyone who would look upon their tomb for eternity? The reliefs are detailed scenes of the two men touching noses, embracing, standing side by side at feasts. If you've seen Egyptian depictions of husbands and wives, you might feel a déjà vu. Isn't it curious how their iconography mirrors the intimacy of marital unions? Some Egyptologists once tried to explain it away as brotherhood, or perhaps twinship, yet there's no evidence to confirm such a familial link. So why would they be represented with the closeness reserved for spouses? Was it friendship, raised to divine levels? Or might it be a story of love that dared not speak its name? You picture the artisans chiseling the scenes into stone. Did they think this will confuse people someday? Or did they believe it was perfectly normal, not needing explanation? After all, ancient societies had their own frameworks for relationships, ones that may not match our modern categories of friendship and marriage. Could Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's bond have been understood in their time in a way we can no longer fully decode? Isn't it a bit like finding an old photo album where the captions are missing? You see the smiles, but you don't know the story behind them. Their titles give more clues. Niankkhnum was the overseer of the manicurists of the palace of King Niuser. Khnumhotep shared similar prestigious positions. They were not obscure figures. They were men of influence. Does that make their joint burial more remarkable? Would two ordinary servants have been allowed such liberties in representation? Or did their closeness slip by unnoticed precisely because of their high rank? Sometimes power provides not just wealth, but also a shield for personal choices. Could that have been the case here? Imagine walking through their tomb in the 1960s when it was rediscovered. Archaeologists must have blinked twice at the scenes. At that time, scholars hesitated to interpret the embrace as anything other than symbolic. But modern eyes bring modern questions. Might we finally be seeing what earlier generations didn't want to? Or are we at risk of imposing our own categories where they don't belong? That tension between evidence and interpretation makes the tomb endlessly fascinating. One detail stands out. Khnum and Khnumhotep were each married to women and had children. Their wives are depicted in the tomb too, but often pushed to the margins, carved smaller, less prominent. Is this an accident of design or a quiet hint that their central relationship was not with their wives, but with each other? When you picture modern family photos, where one person is always placed just outside the frame, doesn't it make you wonder who the photographer wanted to highlight? Could the ancient artisans have been doing something similar? And here's a modern comparison to chew on. Think of how biographies from the 19th century sometimes described two men as having a passionate friendship or called women inseparable companions. Were those euphemisms for romance or simply intense platonic bonds? We debate it now because the language was deliberately vague. Perhaps the same ambiguity hovers over this Egyptian tomb. Isn't it remarkable how humans across cultures and centuries have always found ways to cloak intimacy in phrases that blur the line between affection and love? Standing in that chamber, you can almost sense the silence of history pressing down. Was their burial side by side a final declaration of partnership, a bold statement that they belonged together for eternity? Or was it just convenience? Two officials sharing a grand tomb to save space and resources, without a diary, without a confession etched into stone, we can't be sure. But the very fact that their story invites so many questions makes you realize how much of ancient life remains hidden in plain sight. As you trace the hieroglyphs with your eyes, you feel the weight of mystery. Did Khnum and Khnumhotep see themselves as spouses? Did their society accept their closeness or simply ignore it? We may never know. But the tomb remains quietly challenging every visitor to look to wonder and to ask what kind of love lasts long enough to be carved into eternity. And as you step away from the tomb of Khnum and Khnumhotep, still turning over those unanswered questions in your head, the desert wind seems to carry you further east toward Mesopotamia, where another kind of mystery unfolds under the moon. You climb the stone steps of a ziggurat, the air heavy with incense and whispers of prayers rising into the Mesopotamian night. Somewhere above, the priests are preparing offerings under the silver glow of the moon, god Nana. You pause, listening to chants that sound almost like lullabies, and you ask yourself, were these rituals only about honoring the gods? Or could they also have included expressions of human intimacy that blurred the line between devotion and desire? The temple records speak of sacred marriages, ceremonies meant to mirror the union of deities. A priestess might embody a goddess, while a high official represented a god. But some sources hint that temple attendants, male as well as female, participated in rites where gender roles were more fluid than we might expect. Were these roles purely symbolic, or did they allow for relationships that society outside the temple walls would never have sanctioned? Could it be that within sacred space, rules bent and boundaries softened? Imagine yourself watching a procession of priests and attendants, their garments gleaming with gold thread. The hymns echo, the torches crackle. Suddenly, the ceremony feels less like politics and more like theater, every gesture layered with meaning. When tablets mention companions of the goddess or beloved of the god, are they speaking only in metaphor? Or are they hinting at connections between people that outsiders were never meant to see? Isn't it possible that in the flicker of torchlight, devotion and affection could look indistinguishable? Some historians point to the cult of Inanna, goddess of love and war, as a space where boundaries were constantly challenged. Her hymns celebrate passion in all its forms. Her temples known for rituals that elevated desire as sacred. Could attendants embodying her spirit have shared moments that looked suspiciously like romance? If worship itself was entwined with celebrating love, why would its expressions be confined only to man and woman unions? You think about how even today, rituals sometimes carry undertones beyond their stated purpose. A choir might sing love songs to God, but the emotions stirred are deeply human. A festival might commemorate a myth, yet in the dancing crowd, people form bonds that outlast the holiday. Could Mesopotamian temple life have worked the same way publicly? Divine, privately human. Archaeologists have found cuneiform texts describing male temple prostitutes, though the exact meaning of the word prostitute in this context is debated. Were they truly selling intimacy, or were they sacred figures enacting a ritual drama? The ambiguity leaves you guessing. And doesn't that uncertainty say more about us than about them? Maybe what we call taboo was in their eyes simply part of the spiritual cycle. Think of how modern theater uses actors to represent lovers who may not be lovers in real life. Yet when the curtain falls, the passion still lingers in the air. Could the Mesopotamian temple stage have been similar? Were the participants actors only? Or did something genuine spill over from the ritual into their personal lives? And if so, who would have dared to write that down on clay tablets for all eternity? The moon climbs higher, casting silver shadows over the ziggurat steps. You imagine the worshippers below, offering grain and wine, unaware of what might unfold in the temple's inner chambers. Or perhaps they knew and accepted it as part of the divine mystery. When hymns praise, beloved companions of the gods, do they reflect only myth, or are they faint echoes of real human ties that we can barely glimpse through the cracks of history? The night air feels charged as you descend the chants still humming in your ears. You carry with you the lingering question: were these rituals nothing more than theater of faith? Or were they also a safe haven for bonds the outside world left unspoken? And with those chants still echoing in your ears, you find yourself drifting westward, past the sands and rivers until marble pillars rise before you. Here in Greece, the story changes, because this is the place where love between men is not hidden in shadows, but written into legend. If Egypt left us hints, and Mesopotamia left us riddles, then Greece left us poetry myths and sculptures that speak with surprising boldness. You wander through a courtyard where statues gleam white against the sun, and you notice how often two male figures stand locked in companionship. Was this just artistic tradition, or does it reflect something much deeper about the bonds they celebrated? Think of Achilles and Patroclus. Homer never states outright what their relationship was, but why did later writers and philosophers return to them again and again, debating whether they were more than friends? Was the intimacy of their connection something the ancients simply assumed everyone understood? And if so, why do we still argue about it thousands of years later? Isn't it interesting that ambiguity itself becomes part of the legacy? You pass through the gymnasia, those training grounds where young men studied philosophy, trained their bodies, and formed mentorships with older citizens. Philosophers like Plato wrote dialogues that both praised and critiqued these relationships. Were these mentorships purely educational, or did affection blur the lines? Plato's Symposium describes love between men as a ladder to divine truth. Was he being metaphorical, or was he describing lived experience? And then there's Alcibiades' the flamboyant Athenian general who barged into Plato's dialogue half-drunk, confessing his infatuation with Socrates. Is this just literary theater, or a record of how openly desire could be discussed in Athens? Imagine the shock if a modern political leader stood up in a philosophy seminar today and declared undying love for their teacher. Would we laugh, or would we analyze it as deeply as historians analyze Alcibiades' words? Sparta gives another twist. Young warriors lived in barracks together for years, training side by side. Some sources suggest that bonds between soldiers were encouraged, even celebrated, because affection could strengthen loyalty on the battlefield. Was this a pragmatic strategy or a cultural value? When the Theban sacred band, 150 pairs of male lovers, stood as an elite fighting force, does that not suggest that love and war were intertwined in ways we rarely imagine today? The myths go further. Zeus, king of the gods, carried off the beautiful youth, Ganymede, to be his cupbearer on Olympus. Was this tale just about power, or did it also reflect human fascination with same-sex desire? When vase paintings show the two together, was it simply a myth retold in art? Or did it also mirror human practices below the heavens? As you stroll through the agora, you picture debates under colonnades. Philosophers argued about whether love between men was noble or shameful. Some called it the highest form of affection. Others worried it distracted from civic duty. Doesn't it sound a little like modern debates about what society should or shouldn't accept? Only the setting has changed, the marble benches replaced by television studios and talk shows. One striking detail in Athens' relationships were often defined by age and role, rather than by fixed categories like straight or gay. The older partner was expected to guide the younger to learn. But was this system about pedagogy, or was it also about affection? And when the younger partner grew older, did the relationship end or evolve? The fact that we can't pin down exact answers shows how fluid and complex human bonds have always been. You pause before another statue. Two figures carved so close, their marble robes almost touch. Were they heroes, friends, lovers? The sculptor didn't leave a note. And maybe that's the point, to leave us staring, guessing, asking questions that keep the story alive long after the marble has weathered. Leaving behind the philosopher's colonnades, you wander south toward the rugged hills of Sparta, where the clatter of shields and the smell of sweat replace marble debates. Here the tone feels different, less poetry, more discipline. But the question of bonds between men doesn't disappear. It only takes on a sharper edge. Picture the barracks rows of young warriors stripped down for training bruises on their arms, laughter echoing after sparring matches. They slept side by side, ate together, and faced the brutal rhythms of Spartan life from adolescence into adulthood. When every part of your existence is shared with another, is it really a stretch to imagine that some of those bonds went deeper than camaraderie? And if they did, was it discouraged, or was it quietly encouraged as a way of making soldiers fight more fiercely for one another? Ancient sources drop tantalizing hints. Some writers suggest that Spartan authorities frowned on excessive attachment, fearing it might weaken the collective. Others whisper that affectionate ties were not only tolerated, but woven into the very structure of military life. Could both be true, depending on the moment, the leader, or the individual relationship? Isn't it possible that what was considered dangerous one year might be praised as loyalty the next? You think of the Theban sacred band, an elite unit of 150 male couples who fought side by side. Centuries later, Plutarch praised them, noting that warriors bound by affection would stand firm because they could not bear to shame each other. Was Sparta's own system similar, only less explicitly recorded, or did the Spartans maintain a more utilitarian approach where closeness was assumed but never openly named? Imagine lying on a straw mat after a day of drills, your body aching, your closest companion just inches away. Do you talk about your fears before battle? Do you whisper dreams of glory? Or do you simply share silence, knowing words aren't needed? How much of what we call romance today could have grown naturally out of that setting without ever being labeled as such? Modern parallels come to mind. Military comrades often describe a closeness that outsiders struggle to understand, a bond forged in shared hardship. Some even call it closer than family. If this can be true in modern armies, why not in the barracks of Sparta? Perhaps the difference is only in what words they used to describe it, or whether they left written confessions behind. And yet the Spartans were notoriously secretive. They left behind fewer texts than Athens, fewer plays and dialogues to pick apart. So we're left with shadows. Was their silence an attempt to hide something, or simply the result of a culture more interested in deeds than words? Sometimes what's missing from history is as telling as what survives. Even their rituals raise questions. Boys were paired with older mentors during training. Was this purely educational, shaping discipline and values? Or did it sometimes carry undertones of intimacy, as some later commentators suggested? With so little evidence, we're left staring at the gaps, trying to imagine the conversations that echoed in those stone-walled barracks long after torches went dark. You can almost hear the clash of bronze on bronze in the training yard. The grunts of sparring matches the sudden bursts of laughter that follow. Were these sounds only the soundtrack of soldiers, or were they also the background music of friendships and affections we'll never fully decode? And when the echoes of Spartan shields fade, you find yourself drifting into the marble courtyards of Rome, where whispers replace war cries. Here, desire isn't trained into soldiers. It slips through palace doors, hides in poetry, and surfaces in the gossip of senators. Roman culture was tangled, wasn't it? On one hand, you hear strict moralists railing about proper family values. On the other, the same society produced satirists who casually joked about emperors' dalliances with men. Which voice tells the truth? Or do both reflect a city where public image and private indulgence never quite matched? You stroll past a villa fresco showing a banquet couches arranged for reclining guests. Wine flows, laughter fills the room, and in the shadows of the oil lamps, who knows what conversations or touches passed unnoticed? Was this simply elite excess? Or did some of those whispers reveal genuine bonds? How often do you think love hides behind the excuse of entertainment? The emperors themselves complicate the story. Nero famously staged a mock wedding with a man named Sporus, reportedly treating him as a wife in front of the court. Was this political theater meant to shock, or an expression of something personal that Nero refused to suppress? Elagabalus, too, was rumored to have taken male partners openly. Were these scandals exaggerated by hostile historians, or traces of truths that contemporaries could neither ignore nor fully accept? Isn't it curious how gossip becomes our main source of evidence? Poets also played their part. Martial, known for his biting epigrams, sprinkled jokes about male relationships throughout his verses. Was he mocking or normalizing? Could humor have been a safer way to acknowledge what couldn't be said seriously? After all, even today, don't comedians often raise topics? Others avoid slipping truth between punchlines. The legal codes add another layer. Roman law didn't categorize people by orientation, but by social role, who acted, who received, who held status. Was this a reflection of genuine cultural attitudes, or a way of keeping hierarchies intact? For Rome, everything seemed to be about power. So perhaps intimacy, too, was judged less by affection than by who maintained dominance. Yet even in such a rigid framework, surely real emotions existed quietly defying the rules. You wander into the baths, steam rising mosaics glittering underfoot. Here senators, merchants, and soldiers mingled in spaces where the boundaries of class softened. Did these places also blur the boundaries of relationships? Was the bathhouse only for relaxation, or was it also a setting for encounters that official histories conveniently skipped? Imagine future archaeologists studying modern spas or gyms. Would they really capture everything that happened inside Cicero's stern in his oratory, sometimes hinted at accusations against rivals mocking their supposed indulgences? But were these slurs purely political weapons, or veiled acknowledgments that such relationships were familiar to everyone? Politics thrives on innuendo after all. Isn't it likely that some of these insults only made sense because audiences knew exactly what was being implied? Walking through Rome at night, past torch-lit streets and taverns, you can't help but wonder how many stories of affection never made it to parchment because scribes preferred tales of conquest. How many couples walk these streets holding secrets as carefully as coins in a purse? We see glimpses only in satire, scandal, and law codes. The rest lies in silence and empire's private life hidden beneath marble grandeur. The last whispers of Roman gossip are still circling in your head when your path suddenly collides with something entirely different: walls of Indian temples so crowded with carvings that they almost seem alive. Unlike the satire and rumors of Rome here, the stone itself is speaking boldly, openly, without hesitation. Were ancient Indians less concerned with hiding the complexities of love and identity than others? You tilt your head up at the famous temples of Khajuraho, every inch covered in sculpted figures. Some scenes look familiar: husbands and wives, divine unions. But others, pairs of men, groups of figures, combinations that defy the neat categories modern society often insists on. Were these merely artistic exaggerations, or reflections of lived traditions? Could the artisans have been telling us, desire takes many forms, don't pretend otherwise? The texts echo the same theme. The Kama Sutra, often reduced in modern pop culture to a manual of positions, actually contains passages describing relationships between men. It doesn't condemn, it describes. Was this neutral record-keeping, or acceptance woven into daily life? And if a text could calmly include such details, doesn't that suggest a cultural awareness that later societies might have tried to erase? You pause at stories from Hindu mythology. Consider Shikandi, born female, later living as male, whose role in the epic Mahabharata proves essential to victory. Was this tale only symbolic, or was it recognition of gender fluidity that communities already understood? Another myth tells of Ardhanarishvara, Shiva, and Parvati merged into one body, half male, half female. Was this only cosmic metaphor, or also a reflection of how identity itself could transcend rigid boundaries? On the streets of ancient India, evidence points to the presence of a third gender people who didn't fit neatly into male or female categories. Today, they are known as Hijras, a community that still exists, though marginalized. In antiquity, however, inscriptions suggest they had respected roles in courts and rituals. Were they guardians of temples, performers of blessings, participants in ceremonies of birth and marriage? If so, does that not indicate a recognition of identities outside the binary long before modern debates? Picture a royal court where a king consults astrologers, priests, and also trusted members of the third gender for advice. Could their voices have been valued not in spite of, but because of their difference? In societies where cosmic balance was paramount, might their presence have symbolized harmony itself? Isn't it striking that what later eras dismissed as taboo may once have been woven into the very structure of power? Think of modern parallels. How often marginalized voices today bring perspectives others overlook. If this is true in the 21st century, why wouldn't it have been true in a world where myth and daily life blurred together? Walking through those temple courtyards, the carvings seem less like decoration and more like testimony. Were the sculptors recording what they saw in real life? Or were they idealizing a cosmic truth, giving form to possibilities that ordinary people might only whisper about? Either way, the message carved in stone is hard to miss. Love and identity were never one size fits all. And so you stand before Ardhanarishvara's image, half male, half female, watching the divine form balance opposites with serene calm. Is it a myth of gods only, or a reminder that humans too have always lived between categories? The silence of the temple doesn't answer, but perhaps it doesn't need to. The carvings already ask enough questions to keep you wondering long after you step back into the sunlight. The image of Ardhanarishvara still lingers in your mind, but the flutter of parchment pulls you further east. In China, the stories don't come from temple walls or mythic epics. They slip quietly from scrolls and poems tucked between calligraphy strokes and court records. And here, a different question rises. How much affection could an emperor show before history turned it into gossip? The tale of the cut sleeve is perhaps the most famous. Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty was said to love his companion Dongxian so deeply that when Dong fell asleep on his robe, the emperor cut off the sleeve rather than wake him. Was this a grand romantic gesture, or simply a charming anecdote polished by storytellers? Did court scribes exaggerate the scene to capture Ai's devotion, or was it so unusual that it became unforgettable? Either way, the story survived 2,000 years. Doesn't that alone suggest its power? You imagine palace courtyards, lanterns glowing silk, rustling courtiers watching every move. In such a setting, how much freedom did an emperor really have? Could Ai openly favor Dong without provoking whispers? Some records suggest Dong rose to immense political power despite his youth. Was his influence solely based on talent, or was it tied to the affection of the emperor? And if it was, does that make the story less about love and more about politics, or both entwined? Other emperors left traces too. The Han Tong and Song dynasties all contain poems and anecdotes hinting at male-male affection. Poets like Ruan Ji wrote verses that linger on the beauty of young men. Were these simply literary conventions or windows into real experiences? When a scholar compares a friend's eyes to moonlight, is it flattery or confession? The line between art and life is never easy to draw. Court politics complicates everything. Historians hostile to an emperor often painted him as morally corrupt, and one of the easiest accusations was indulgence in forbidden love. Was this slander or grudging acknowledgement of relationships that did exist? Could the records we now treat as evidence have been little more than political smear campaigns? If so, isn't it ironic that what was once meant as insult now serves as historical proof of affection? You glance at scrolls describing the passion of the cut sleeve or the half-eaten peach, another metaphor for shared desire between men. Why were these metaphors so enduring? Did they provide a safe, poetic way to speak of love without inviting condemnation? Or were they widely understood symbols, part of a cultural vocabulary everyone recognized? Imagine future generations reading our slang-filled text messages. How many meanings would be lost or misread because the context disappeared? Modern parallels slip into mind. Think of how celebrities today face endless speculation about their relationships, every gesture analyzed, every photograph dissected. If we can't agree on the private lives of people living now, how much harder is it to pin down the truth of an emperor and his companion? 2 millennia ago, you picture Dong Zhan walking the polished halls, his sleeve brushing the emperor's as courtiers watch from the shadows. Was it love? Was it strategy? Or was it simply a human story, later magnified into legend? The truth may be lost, but the questions remain, etched not in stone this time, but in the delicate brushstrokes of ink. The faint scent of ink and silk from China still clings to your imagination when a different rhythm reaches you, drums chants, and the earthy pulse of African soil. Here the trail doesn't lead through palaces filled with scrolls, but through oral traditions, carved masks, and whispered memories passed down in songs. And once again, you wonder, have we overlooked entire chapters of intimacy simply because they weren't written on parchment? In the heart of ancient Nubia, rulers carved their triumphs on temple walls. Yet some reliefs show attendants and companions standing unusually close hands, resting on shoulders, with a softness that feels deliberate. Were these just symbolic signs of loyalty or subtle hints of affection? Could royal art have carried personal meanings invisible to outsiders? When the sculptor chipped those lines into stone, did they already know? Future eyes might miss the message. Travel west in your mind to the kingdom of Dahomey. Oral traditions speak of female warriors, the Agoji sometimes called the Dahomey Amazons. They lived in military compounds, separate from men bound by loyalty to one another and to the king. Did bonds form there that were deeper than discipline? Could intimacy have flourished in spaces where women relied entirely on each other for survival? Historians hesitate to answer, but the very question lingers. Southward, among the Zulu early ethnographers, noted practices of young men forming boy-wives relationships that blurred categories of mentorship, companionship, and intimacy. Were these reports accurate observations or colonial misinterpretations shaped by outsiders' biases? Did those communities view the relationships differently than the rigid labels imposed later? Isn't it possible that what seemed unusual to European eyes was simply accepted within its own cultural framework? And then there's the Sand People, whose rock art stretches back thousands of years. Some images depict pairs of figures engaged in what looks less like hunting and more like closeness. Were those scenes spiritual metaphors or everyday realities captured in pigment? When the artists painted them on cave walls, were they celebrating human connection in its many forms or weaving myths too subtle for us to decode? Modern comparisons creep in. Think of how entire histories of marginalized communities were erased simply because they weren't recorded in books. Isn't it likely that African traditions held countless stories of love outside the narrow definitions we've inherited? But those stories faded when oral voices were silenced by conquest and colonization. If history is written by the victors, how many human bonds were lost because the victors didn't care to preserve them? Even colonial records biased as they were occasionally note practices that don't fit the imported template of European morality. Missionaries wrote of confusion when they encountered African communities where same-sex bonds were acknowledged, or at least not punished. Were they seeing truth, or distorting it through their own shock? Either way, their bewilderment suggests that such practices existed otherwise. What would there have been to comment on? You stand at the edge of a savanna in your imagination, the sun-low drums carrying across the horizon. Families gather, stories are told, and elders weave lessons for the young. Were there once tales now forgotten that spoke of companions bound by love rather than blood? Did those tales carry wisdom about acceptance that colonial ink erased? The silence feels heavy, but also suggestive, as though the land itself still holds secrets we've barely begun to ask about. The drum beats of Africa fade into memory, and now you lie back, as if under the stars, letting every fragment of history swirl together. Across tombs, temples, palaces, and oral traditions, one thread has run quietly through it all: the suggestion that love, desire, and identity were never as simple as the categories we try to impose. If ancient civilizations were so diverse in how they hinted at intimacy, what does that say about the stories we tell ourselves today? You think of Egypt's double officials painted like spouses. Were they brothers, friends, or something deeper? You recall Mesopotamia's temple rituals, where chants blurred devotion and desire. Did worship mask affection? Greece gave you poetry and myths that left generations debating Achilles and Patroclus, while Sparta's barracks whispered about bonds forged in hardship. Rome turned the subject into satire, scandals, and law codes that cared less about love than about power. India carved its testimony into stone, celebrating fluid identities openly, while China preserved its secrets in scrolls, symbols, and metaphors like the cut sleeve. Africa added oral traditions, elusive but insistent, suggesting that what colonial pens dismissed may once have been woven into the fabric of life. And isn't it striking how all of this leaves you asking questions rather than finding answers? Perhaps that's the very point. Maybe history resists giving us certainty, because certainty never existed to begin with. Human bonds have always shifted with culture, context, and circumstance. What if the real lesson is not about labeling the past, but about recognizing its complexity? Think of modern life. Even with photographs, videos, and social media, people argue endlessly about who loves whom, about what gestures mean, about which relationships fit, which boxes. If we can't even agree on our own century, how could we possibly settle debates about lives lived thousands of years ago? Doesn't that make the ambiguity of ancient art, myth, and poetry feel less like a flaw and more like an honest reflection of reality? You let your mind wander back to the tombs, scrolls, and temples you visited tonight. Each left a puzzle, a half-told story, a gesture frozen in stone or ink. Were these deliberate secrets, coded messages meant to survive across centuries? Or are they simply echoes we choose to interpret through the lens of our own times? Either way, they remind you that the past was not as uniform as the textbooks once claimed. And maybe that's what makes this untold history so powerful. Not because it gives you neat conclusions, but because it leaves you with wonder. Wonder about Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep. Wonder about Achilles and Patroclus. Wonder about emperors who cut sleeves and sculptors who carved half-male, half-female divinities into temple walls. Wonder about stories lost to colonization, yet still humming faintly in oral traditions. As you close your eyes, you realize the past is not silent at all. It hums with unanswered questions, daring you to keep listening. And perhaps the most important question of all is this: if love, in its many forms, has always been present, how much of our modern certainty is just another layer of storytelling? Across tombs, temples, scrolls, and oral traditions, you've wandered through hints, metaphors, and half-forgotten stories that suggest love and identity in the ancient world were far more diverse than neat categories allow. From Egypt's paired officials to China's cut sleeve and India's temple carvings, history left questions, not answers, whispers, that intimacy wore many faces. And if even affection was cloaked in ambiguity, what about the practices that were too bold, too unsettling, too strange to hide step closer now, because the next doors open not to whispers, but to shocks the most startling sexual customs ancient civilizations ever dared? You jolt awake with the kind of surprise that makes you rub your eyes, because the first stop in this journey isn't about incense quiet prayers or tossing grain into fire pits. No, what shocks you is the realization that in ancient civilizations, pleasing the gods often meant going far beyond offerings of food or song. Some communities genuinely believed that their very survival, rainfall, harvests, protection from famine, depended on rituals where devotion blurred into deeply personal acts performed beneath temple torchlight. Imagine standing in Mesopotamia at the base of a towering ziggurat, watching farmers and kings alike walk up the steps to participate in rites they thought could secure the universe's favor. To them, this wasn't scandal. It was sacred insurance. You hear the echo of hymns to Inanna, goddess of love and war, where fertility and divine power blended so seamlessly that separating worship from intimacy seemed impossible. Archaeologists still debate whether every villager took part or whether many only offered grain and livestock, but the legends are bold enough to keep scholars arguing. And doesn't that uncertainty make you wonder if modern people sign online petitions or light candles in hopes of influencing fate? Is it really so strange that ancient people tried physical devotion as their insurance policy? Different tools, same desperation. Kings of Sumer and Babylon sometimes staged elaborate sacred marriages with high priestesses reenacting the union of gods to declare their reign blessed. This wasn't just theater, it was statecraft. A king claiming divine approval stood taller in the eyes of his subjects, much like modern leaders pose for photo opportunities to project strength. Can you imagine today's politicians attempting a ritual wedding in front of cameras to keep their approval ratings steady? News channels would explode. Memes would flood the internet, and late-night comedians would dine on the material for months. But who told these stories? And why Greek historians love describing their rivals' religious life in ways that made them seem decadent, and sometimes they exaggerated details to scandalize readers back home? Were they faithfully recording fact, or acting more like gossip columnists eager to sell a story? The line is hard to draw. Still, ancient inscriptions and temple carvings repeatedly show symbols of divine union, grain offerings paired with human couples and kings, standing as intermediaries between heaven and earth. The consistency suggests at least some level of truth, even if the exact details are fuzzy. When you look at the walls, etched with images sometimes abstract, sometimes unmistakably suggestive, you can't help asking how much was symbolic and how much was literal. Isn't it fascinating how entire cultures built moral codes around the belief that gods not only watched, but demanded participation in rituals that mirrored creation itself. The shock comes not from whether people believed, but from how confidently they practiced, often in public, as if the act itself was prayer. And here's where perspective matters. Modern audiences may recoil, yet for ancient people, these rites were not indulgence, but obligation. To refuse was to risk angering the divine, to gamble with the harvest, to invite drought. In their eyes, planting seeds in the earth and performing these ceremonies were one and the same, both acts of fertility, both necessary for life to continue. When you let that realization sink in, the torchlight flickers a little brighter, the hymns feel heavier, and the so-called shocking behavior begins to look like survival, dressed in ritual robes. You step away from the echoing hymns of Mesopotamia and find yourself drawn into the golden light of Egypt, where the Nile glitters like a ribbon of life. But survival here doesn't just mean coaxing wheat and barley from the fertile banks. It also means managing family size, ensuring heirs, and navigating the mysteries of fertility with the same urgency as steering a boat across the river's currents. So people turned to some of the strangest remedies you could imagine. Crocodile dung mixed with honey acacia pods, ground into paste sour milk, dates blended with plant fibers, all of it pressed, smeared, or swallowed in the belief that these bizarre concoctions could prevent pregnancy or spark desire. Doesn't it make you pause, picturing someone in a linen tunic, insisting with confidence? This really works as they hold up a jar you'd hesitate to open. The evidence doesn't just come from rumor. Ancient papyrus texts like the Ebers papyrus or the Kahun papyrus preserve recipes for contraceptives that read more like kitchen experiments than medical prescriptions. Honey mixed with natron was recommended not for taste, but for blocking conception. Acacia pods, curiously enough, produce lactic acid when fermented, which modern science recognizes as having spermicidal properties. So while some remedies may have been more hopeful than helpful, others actually stumbled into genuine effectiveness. Isn't that fascinating that thousands of years before, laboratories, ordinary Egyptians found real chemistry hidden in plants, and the practices weren't confined to the poor? In royal courts, fertility mattered even more. Pharaohs needed heirs to stabilize dynasties, and queens needed protection from endless pregnancies that could weaken them. Cleopatra, often remembered for her beauty and politics, was rumored to explore herbal aphrodisiacs and concoctions designed to enhance allure or control conception. Can't you almost see her servants preparing mixtures in the shadow of Alexandria's libraries, treating these brews not as superstition, but as strategy? After all, for someone negotiating alliances with Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, controlling fertility could mean controlling the fate of empires. But remedies went beyond prevention. They were also about attraction. Egyptians believed mandrake roots, onions, and even lettuce carried powers to stir desire. Mandrakes appeared in mythology and art, often connected with love and fertility. Lettuce, associated with the god Min, symbolized potency. Imagine strolling through a market in Thebes, passing baskets of onions and hearing a merchant shout, "Guaranteed to win the heart of your beloved." You might laugh, but in a culture where gods were invoked in every part of daily life, vegetables weren't just food. They were tokens of cosmic influence. And then there's the social layer. Families shared these remedies through whispered traditions, grandmothers passing recipes to daughters, healers offering advice alongside prayers. Survival knowledge wasn't written in glossy medical journals. It was carried in clay jars and whispered in corridors. Can you picture a nervous young bride clutching a sachet of herbs, relying on the wisdom of older women who swore these methods kept families balanced? These weren't eccentric curiosities to them. They were lifelines as vital as the Nile's flood. Still, some practices provoke a shiver. Crocodile dung, for instance, seems almost comical. But when you remember that crocodiles were sacred in Egyptian religion, embodied in the god Sobek, it suddenly makes symbolic sense. Using the creature's waste wasn't only about function. It was about invoking divine power. Isn't it striking how belief systems can transform something revolting into something sacred, even protective? Where modern people might carry a lucky charm, Egyptians trusted crocodile dung. Different times. Same impulse to clutch at hope. Of course, not every claim held truth. Some mixtures were probably useless, and others might have been harmful. But desperation often blurs the line between cure and poison. And doesn't that feel oddly familiar? Today's shelves still carry supplements with bold promises, diets with little evidence, and gadgets that look suspiciously like snake oil in a shiny package. Future generations may shake their heads at us, the same way we shake ours at dung remedies. History teaches humility. Every age thinks it's clever, and every age leaves traces that look absurd centuries later. So you wander further into the Egyptian streets in your imagination, sunlight flashing off copper pots, air thick with the smell of bread and onions. Merchants, bargain children, chase each other. And somewhere in the corner, a woman leans in to whisper a recipe she swears will save a family from ruin. It isn't comedy to her, it's survival. And as you let that sink in, jars of honey and baskets of herbs take on a new weight. These weren't just quirks of ancient life. They were attempts to wrestle with destiny using the only tools they had. You wander deeper into Mesopotamia, the land of rivers where the ziggurats rise like stairways to the gods and the night smells of incense and oil lamps. But tonight, the focus isn't on kings performing symbolic marriages. It's on ordinary people climbing those steps, hearts pounding, ready to take part in rituals that might shock you. These ceremonies blurred devotion and intimacy, drawing farmers, merchants, and soldiers into the orbit of priestesses who stood as the earthly vessels of Ishtar or Inanna. To them, it wasn't scandal, it was survival. If the goddess was pleased, crops would flourish, families would multiply, and cities would be protected. Isn't it strange to imagine worship not as kneeling in silence, but as stepping into an act that bound body and cosmos together? Historians call this sacred prostitution, though the term is controversial. Some scholars argue it was central to Mesopotamian religion, while others say later writers exaggerated or misinterpreted. Herodotus, the Greek historian, claimed that every Babylonian woman, once in her life, had to sit in the temple of Ishtar until a stranger chose her. Was he reporting fact? Or was he smearing Babylon with a tale meant to horrify Greek audiences? The truth may lie somewhere between rumor and ritual. But the consistency of these accounts across cultures suggests something unusual really did take place. Clay tablets mention offerings made through the lap of the goddess, a poetic phrase, but one heavy with implication. Picture yourself at a festival. The temple glows with torches, drums echo across the square, and the scent of roasted meat mingles with myrrh. Pilgrims line up, some trembling with reverence, others swept along by peer pressure. To them, participating was not indulgence, but duty, an act ensuring the goddess would bless their families. You might compare it to modern citizens singing national anthems or joining public parades rituals that unify a community. But in Mesopotamia, the stakes felt more personal and the involvement much more direct. Would you have had the courage to join such a line? The economic side of the temple was just as important. Ziggurats weren't only religious centers, they were banks and warehouses holding grain, collecting taxes, and managing land. Ritual participation often came with offerings, silver coins, jars of oil, baskets of dates that enriched the temple treasury. Some scholars suggest that framing intimacy as ritual allowed the temple to sanctify what was essentially an exchange of goods and services. In a way, it legitimized what elsewhere might have been hidden. Doesn't it make you wonder how institutions, ancient or modern, often sanctify practical needs by clothing them in ritual language? Then there's politics. Kings sometimes joined these rites during New Year festivals, acting out a symbolic union with the goddess through a high priestess. This wasn't private, it was public theater, meant to confirm divine approval of their reign. Imagine standing in the crowd, watching a ruler walk toward the sanctuary, knowing his power rested not only on soldiers, but on convincing everyone that heaven itself desired him on the throne. Doesn't it echo modern leaders staging dramatic ceremonies, handshakes, or photo opportunities to prove legitimacy? Different stage, same human instinct power must be seen to be believed. Yet not everyone admired these practices. Later Hebrew and Christian writers condemned Babylon as a place of corruption, branding its temples as dens of immorality. Their words turned Babylon into a symbol of excess and sin. But were they describing reality or creating an enemy image? Think about how rival nations today paint one another as decadent or corrupt. It's often propaganda more than fact. Still, the story stuck, shaping how future generations viewed Mesopotamian worship. Isn't it striking how the loudest critics often get to write the history books? Archaeology adds texture to the debate, texture to the tablets, record payments to temple priestesses, inscriptions describe offerings linked to fertility, and art shows couples beneath divine symbols. None of it proves Herodotus completely right, but it also doesn't erase the possibility. The ambiguity itself feels telling something happened in those temples that made outsiders gasp and insiders believe. And perhaps the details blurred intentionally because mystery strengthens awe. As you leave that imagined temple, the drums fading behind you, the smell of incense still in your clothes, you realize the power of ritual lies not just in action, but in belief. For Mesopotamians, worship wasn't only words cast upward into the sky. It was written into the body, acted out beneath torchlight, and folded into the rhythm of the city's life. Whether exaggerated by foreign storytellers or faithfully preserved by local scribes, these temple nights reveal a world where the sacred and the shocking were one and the same. You barely step away from the incense-filled air of Mesopotamia before being jolted into Greece, where the glow of oil lamps and the clink of bronze cups reveal a very different kind of gathering. Picture yourself reclining on a couch at a symposium, wine diluted with water, swirling in your cup, surrounded by philosophers, poets, and generals, and realizing this wasn't just about drinking. It was about weaving together conversation, entertainment, and relationships that startled outsiders then, and still raise eyebrows today. The symposium wasn't simply a dinner party. It was an institution, a stage where Greek men displayed wit, debated politics, shared music, and engaged in connections that blurred the lines between mentorship and intimacy. The host chose the guests carefully, and the evening followed a ritual order, first a meal, then the mixing of wine, always diluted, since drinking it straight was considered barbaric. Afterward came poetry games and discussions. Imagine the room alive with laughter, yet beneath it ran a current of personal bonds between older men and younger companions. Bonds the Greeks treated as natural parts of social life. Doesn't it strike you as odd that what was normalized in Athens might cause scandal if replayed? Today, philosophy gave these practices legitimacy. In Plato's Symposium, Socrates and others delivered speeches on love, presenting it not as mere passion, but as a path toward truth. Socrates argued that physical attraction could serve as the first rung on a ladder that lifted the soul to contemplate eternal beauty. Picture the scene: men with garlands on their heads, drinking games paused, leaning forward as one speaker insists that desire itself can lead to wisdom. Could you imagine your own dinner parties shifting mid-evening from weather talk to metaphysical debates about the soul through love? Yet symposiums were not only intellectual salons, they were also spaces of performance. Guests played kotobos, a game of flicking wine dregs at a target, while musicians played the aulos and dancers performed. But woven into these light-hearted moments were relationships carefully codified by custom. An older man, the Erastes, was expected to guide, protect, and educate a younger partner, the Eromenos. This wasn't meant to be reckless indulgence. It carried rules about honor, self-control, and proper behavior. The younger companion was expected to show modesty, while the elder was judged by the dignity with which he conducted himself. Isn't it fascinating how even affection was placed inside a structure of social duty? Not every city-state treated these bonds the same. In Athens, they were wrapped in philosophy and art. In Sparta, they became part of military training, forging loyalty between soldiers. Thebes went further still, creating the Sacred Band, a legendary troupe of 150 pairs of male lovers who fought side by side. Outsiders may have found it scandalous, but to Thebans, it was a military advantage. The idea was simple: a soldier would never abandon someone he loved. And indeed, the Sacred Band fought with such unity that they became one of the most feared forces in Greece. Doesn't that twist your expectations of what armies consider a weapon, using love itself as strategy? Of course, Greek comedy didn't let these practices escape satire. Playwrights like Aristophanes poked fun at older men, chasing youths, or mocked the imbalance of power when rules were broken. Some philosophers warned against excess arguing, that indulgence could corrupt the purpose of mentorship. The debates reveal a society aware of the fine line between honor and exploitation. Isn't it strangely familiar to hear echoes of conversations we still have today about boundaries and respect? The symposium also exposed stark contrasts between those who could attend and those excluded. Women of status were absent. Wives stayed at home. Instead, hired entertainers, flute girls, dancers, or courtesans filled the room. The inclusion of these figures shows another side of Greek openness. While elite women were sheltered, other women became integral to the public pleasures of men. Can you feel the tension between high philosophy and raw entertainment, between Socratic dialogues and bawdy songs? That tension was the essence of the symposium, serious and playful, lofty and scandalous. Even art reflects this blend. Red figure pottery often depicts symposium scenes: reclining menservants pouring wine, flirtatious gestures, and sometimes outright portrayals of intimacy. These images weren't hidden, they were painted on vessels used in daily life. Imagine sipping from a cup that doubles as a picture book of your society's boldest practices. Doesn't it make you wonder how future generations will view our own art and entertainment? As the night deepens in your imagination, lamps flicker, low garlands slip from foreheads, and debates grow slurred but passionate. Some argue about politics, others about poetry, and glances across couches hint at bonds more personal than philosophical. You notice that for the Greeks, affection wasn't confined to secrecy. It was discussed, debated, celebrated, and occasionally mocked, but rarely hidden. That openness, woven into philosophy, art, and even military tactics, is what shocks modern sensibilities most. And as you rise from the imaginary couch, your cup empty, you realize the symposium wasn't just about wine or conversation. It was about a culture that made desire part of its intellectual fabric, a society unafraid to treat what others might call taboo as material for philosophy, strategy, and art. That's why stepping into a Greek symposium feels like stepping into a world both strangely familiar and utterly alien, where the boundary between shocking and sacred was blurred under the glow of oil lamps. You leave behind the glittering lamps of Athens and walk south into Sparta, where the mood changes as quickly as wine to water. Gone are the couches and poetry contests of the symposium. Here, the sound is the clang of bronze, the thud of boots in rhythm, and the sharp bark of commands shouted across dusty training fields. Sparta built its identity not on words, but on warriors. And inside that brutal machine of discipline was a secret that often startles modern listeners. Bonds between men forged in barracks carried layers of mentorship, respect, and sometimes affection that outsiders later whispered about. But Spartans accepted as part of their system. Doesn't it surprise you that the same city famed for austerity actually harnessed human emotion as a weapon of war? From the age of 7 Spartan boys entered the Agage, the state-run training program that shaped them into soldiers. They left family behind and lived in barracks under the watchful eye of older warriors. Life was harsh, meager rations. Forced boys to steal food punishments were severe, and endurance was tested constantly. Out of this crucible, relationships formed. An older warrior often took responsibility for guiding a younger recruit, teaching him discipline, survival, and the ethos of courage. These bonds were not hidden. They were structured, encouraged, and seen as part of the glue that held the army together. You might think of it as mentorship, except charged with a level of emotional intensity that could blur into what modern audiences would call intimacy. Greek writers described these connections with fascination. Xenophon praised Spartan mentorship for producing disciplined, loyal fighters. Plutarch hinted that these relationships carried layers of devotion that bound men more tightly than law or fear could manage. And when you think of it, doesn't it make sense? A soldier who loves or admires his comrade will not abandon him. He'll fight harder, endure longer, and die rather than break rank. The Spartans understood this instinct and turned it into strategy. The parallels to modern times are striking. Today we talk about the band of brothers effect in armies where camaraderie fuels courage. For Spartans, that effect was amplified by ritualized companionship. Imagine standing in formation, shield locked to shield, knowing the man beside you wasn't just a fellow soldier, but someone whose respect you'd earned over years of shared hardship. Wouldn't that add a weight to your spear thrust? A determination never to let him down. The bonds were regulated, though. Spartan leaders feared that indulgence could weaken discipline, so the relationships had to be framed in terms of honor and virtue. An older man who pursued pleasure without dignity could be ridiculed or punished. The goal was not indulgence, but loyalty. This paradox encouraging affection yet demanding restraint was part of Sparta's unique code. Fire could warm the barracks, but only if kept under control. Doesn't that sound familiar to how societies today try to shape desire into acceptable forms, drawing lines that shift with time? Life in the barracks deepened these ties. Nights were cold, meals were small, and punishments were relentless. Older warriors told stories of battles, whispered advice, or pressed courage into the hearts of boys who would soon fight beside them. These weren't casual friendships. They were bonds built in hunger and pain. When battle came, the phalanx formation demanded absolute trust. Each man's shield protected his neighbor, so loyalty wasn't abstract, it was survival. One coward could doom an entire line. Can you imagine the pressure, the unspoken promise that you'd stand firm, not for yourself, but for the man who trusted you with his life? The power of these relationships became legendary. Thebes, inspired by similar ideals, later formed the Sacred Band, an elite unit of 150 pairs of male lovers. They fought so fiercely that even enemies acknowledged their devotion, made them nearly unbreakable. In 338 BCE, when the Sacred Band finally fell at Chaeronea, the historian Plutarch wrote that they died with their shields locked together, each at his lover's side. That story, echoing Spartan ideals, shows how emotion itself was transformed into military strength. Doesn't it twist your expectations of warfare turning love into a battlefield advantage not everyone in Greece approved? Athenians mocked Spartans for their severity and sometimes for their bonds. Yet even critics admitted Spartan soldiers rarely broke rank, their discipline unmatched. Was it their harsh training, or was it the devotion forged in those barracks? History leaves the answer half hidden, but the results speak loudly in tales of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held a pass against thousands. Imagine those men knowing death was certain, standing shoulder to shoulder with comrades they loved as brothers, or more. And here's where the shock truly lies. To outsiders, whispers of scandal hung over these practices. To Spartans, they weren't scandal at all. They were sacred duty, part of the machinery that kept their society alive. While Athens debated philosophy over wine, Sparta sharpened loyalty into iron. In their world, the strongest soldier wasn't just disciplined. He was bound heart to heart with the man at his side. As you walk out of the Spartan barracks in your imagination, the echo of marching feet trails you like a heartbeat. You realize that here, unlike in Athens, companionship wasn't about clever speeches or painted pottery. It was forged in hunger, sharpened in combat drills, and sanctified in the dust of training fields. What later writers called scandal Spartans called strategy. And that unsettling truth, using affection itself as armor, might be the most shocking revelation of all. You leave the harsh dust of Sparta and step into Rome, where the atmosphere is nothing like barracks or philosophy halls. Here the air smells of roasted meat and perfume. The streets hum with chatter, and behind villa doors, emperors and citizens alike indulge in appetites that make your eyebrows rise. If the Spartans disciplined desire into service, the Romans magnified it into spectacle. Imagine long banquet tables groaning under trays of oysters, figs, and roasted peacocks, goblets of wine endlessly refilled, and after enough drinking conversations that slid effortlessly from politics to passion. Doesn't it strike you that a society that conquered half the known world also devoted so much energy to pleasure? Roman writers didn't shy away from describing excess. Petronius, in his Satyricon, satirized banquets, where host and guests reveled until dawn. mixing entertainment with indulgence. Suetonius painted emperors in even bolder strokes, stories of Caligula inviting noble wives to dinner, only to summon them away mid-feast, or Nero staging performances where boundaries blurred between theater and reality. It's hard to know how much as exaggeration ancient gossip was as ruthless as today's tabloids, but the repetition of these tales suggests kernels of truth. And isn't it telling how scandal often outlives more ordinary details of history? But Roman appetites weren't limited to emperors. Citizens too sought novelty. Public baths became places not only for hygiene, but for meeting mingling, and sometimes arrangements whispered behind steam. Love poetry by Ovid and Catullus reveals a society comfortable writing about desire, with candor weaving humor and longing into verse. Picture someone today posting confessional poetry online, except in Rome, it wasn't scandalous. It was literature celebrated and memorized. Doesn't it make you wonder if our own boundaries are really stricter or just differently drawn? And then there were the feasts. The famous convivium. A dinner party was an event where social rank and indulgence met. Reclining on couches, guests ate course after course, while musicians played and dancers performed. Some dinners lasted all night with entertainment drifting into games and sometimes acts meant to shock. Roman satirists mocked these gatherings, but the fact that satire existed shows how familiar such events were. If nobody ever saw excess, who would laugh at it? At the same time, Roman society was layered with contradictions. Laws promoted family values, urging citizens to marry and produce heirs, while culture celebrated libertine adventures. Augustus passed morality laws to curb what he saw as decline, but gossip about elites undermined every decree. Doesn't it sound familiar when leaders preach restraint, yet get caught in scandals themselves? The Romans might laugh at us for thinking this problem is new. Archaeology brings the stories closer. In Pompeii, and Herculaneum wall paintings and carvings survived the eruption of Vesuvius, showing scenes of banquets, couples, and even frank depictions of intimacy. These weren't hidden away in private corners. They decorated taverns, bathhouses, and homes. Imagine stepping into a dining room with frescoes so bold that a modern visitor might blush before sitting down. Doesn't it say something about how Romans blurred the line between art entertainment and appetite? Not every Roman approved, of course. Stoic philosophers like Seneca warned against indulgence, arguing that pleasure weakened virtue. Others claimed the empire's moral decline was linked to its appetite for excess. Whether or not that's true, it shows that even inside Rome, people debated the balance between pleasure and discipline. Some celebrated indulgence, others condemned it, but all seemed fascinated by it. Isn't it remarkable that debates about decay and morality repeat across every age as you step out of that Roman villa in your imagination? The faint echoes of laughter and music follow you into the street. You realize that for the Romans, appetite was not a guilty secret. It was theater politics and identity rolled into one. They conquered nations with iron, but they shocked history with how openly they feasted on life itself. You leave behind the marble halls of Rome and drift eastward where sandstone temples rise out of India's dust, their towers etched with carvings so intricate they almost breathe. Imagine stepping close to a shrine and realizing the walls are crowded, not just with dancers, warriors, and elephants, but also with couples frozen mid-embrace. These figures aren't tucked away. They are out in the open, greeting every pilgrim. What might cause modern visitors to whisper or blush was once carved into holy walls for all to see. The most famous examples stand at Khajuraho, a cluster of temples built by the Chandala dynasty between the 10th and 12th centuries. Every surface is alive with stone figures, musicians strumming lutes, women adjusting jewelry gods, riding animals, and humans in scenes of startling intimacy. The message wasn't hidden. To the Chandala patrons, this was philosophy and stone teaching that union, whether of man and woman, earth and sky, or Shiva and Shakti, mirrored the rhythm of creation itself. Can you imagine walking into a modern place of worship and finding every wall covered with such carvings? Scholars still debate the meaning. Some argue these images reflect tantric philosophy, where physical union is seen as a doorway to spiritual awakening. Others suggest they served as blessings for fertility and prosperity, encouraging pilgrims to bring life into the world. A few even claim they were warnings, reminders of worldly distraction before stepping inside the sanctum to focus on divine truth. Whatever their purpose, the sheer number of figures leaves little doubt intimacy was seen as a cosmic force woven into the fabric of existence. Isn't it fascinating that what many treat as taboo was once carved into stone as sacred teaching? Look closely, and the detail takes your breath away. Sculptors captured not only bodies, but expressions, smiles, playful gestures, even hints of humor. Animals join the scenes. 2 elephants and monkeys, carved with mischievous energy, as if creation itself was a carnival of life. Jewelry dangles, hairstyles are carefully chiseled, and garments fall in folds that emphasize motion. These weren't crude attempts. They were masterpieces created by artisans who believed that to carve creation, honestly, was to honor the gods. And Khajuraho was not unique. The Sun Temple at Konark in Odisha, built in the 13th century, also displays figures and poses that startled later viewers. Earlier shrines carried similar themes, though sometimes less prominently. The repetition across centuries shows that this wasn't a local fad, but a broader cultural worldview. The sacred and the sensual were inseparable. Doesn't it challenge our modern assumption that spirituality must deny the body? Historical figures help illustrate this mindset. Centuries before Khajuraho, the poet Kalidasa wrote verses in which desire was described as divine energy. In his play, Shakuntala Love unfolds as a sacred bond, echoing the belief that human affection reflected cosmic harmony. Literature, art, and ritual reinforced one another, creating a culture where acknowledging desire was not weakness, but wisdom. Compare that to much of Western tradition, which often tried to divide body and spirit into enemies. Here they were entwined, like vines climbing the same temple wall. Yet interpretations changed over time. As stricter codes developed, and especially when colonial rulers arrived with Victorian sensibilities, these carvings were condemned. British officers who visited Khajuraho in the 19th century described them as obscene, covering them in reports that revealed their embarrassment. They missed the worldview behind the art, reading it only through their own cultural lens. Isn't it striking how the same wall can look like scripture to one generation and scandal to another? Today, tourists travel from around the world to marvel. Some giggle nervously, others stand in awe, cameras clicking, while guides explain symbolism and scholars publish analyses. Pilgrims still visit to pray, treating the temples as sacred regardless of outsiders' interpretations. The carvings survive storms, invasions, and centuries of shifting morals. They stand as stubborn reminders that once upon a time, a civilization dared to put into stone what others hid in whispers. So you walk away from the temple in your imagination, fingertips brushing the warm, sandstone eyes lingering on the carvings that shimmer in the sun. You realize they weren't meant to shock. They were meant to teach that creation is sacred, that union is holy, and that the body and the spirit are not rivals, but allies. And perhaps that's the most surprising lesson of all that in India's ancient temples. Truth wasn't hidden in silence, but carved boldly into the walls for everyone to see. You walk away from the sandstone temples of India, your fingers still tingling with the warmth of carved stone, and suddenly the scene shifts. The chants fade, the incense vanishes, and in its place you hear the strum of shamisen strings and the chatter of crowded streets. Lanterns glow above narrow wooden gates, casting their light across tea houses and winding alleys. You've stepped into Edo Japan's floating world, the ukiyo. Here, intimacy wasn't carved in sandstone or etched into temple pillars. It was painted on paper, performed on stage, and lived beneath the glow of lanterns. Doesn't it feel astonishing that one society saw holiness in stone embraces, while another turned desire into theater and art? The floating world took shape in entertainment districts like Yoshiwara, in Edo-Gion, in Kyoto, and Shimachi, in Osaka. These places were officially licensed and carefully walled, almost like miniature cities inside the city. Once inside, you encountered tea houses, kabuki theaters, and pleasure quarters. But this wasn't only about indulgence, it was culture. Courtesans here were more than companions. They were celebrities, trendsetters, and artists. They mastered music, dance, calligraphy, and witty conversation. A wealthy merchant might spend a fortune to be seen with a famous courtesan, gaining not only her company, but also the prestige that came with it. Doesn't it remind you of modern influencers, where association alone can raise someone's status? Art preserved this world in vivid detail. Shunga woodblock prints, often explicit but also playful, circulated widely. They weren't tucked away in shame. They were exchanged as gifts, collected as prized art, and even treasured as lucky charms. Artists like Hokusai and Utamaro, known worldwide for landscapes and portraits, also produced shunga. Imagine being a merchant, deciding between buying a print of Mount Fuji or a print of lovers under cherry blossoms, both by the same artist, both considered worthy of admiration. Isn't it fascinating how Japanese culture blurred the lines between high art and the private world? Inside the floating world, strict hierarchies softened. Japan outside the walls was rigid samurai, at the top merchants and artisans below. But within Yoshiwara's gates, the rules loosened. A poet could charm a courtesan, a merchant could dine with a samurai, an actor could become a sensation. For a brief night, everyone floated in a shared dream. Doesn't it strike you how societies, no matter how strict, always carve out hidden spaces where people can bend the rules? Kabuki theater added another dimension. Born in the early 1600s, Kabuki dazzled audiences with music, colorful costumes, and exaggerated gestures. Male actors who played female roles, the onagata, became so admired that their fans adored them off stage as well. Audiences blurred the line between performance and reality, forming relationships with actors that mirrored the prints sold outside theaters. Doesn't that sound familiar? Like today's fans who obsess over celebrities' private lives as though the show never ends. The floating world was joyful, but it was also fragile. Courtesans often entered contracts as children bound by debts that lasted for years. While they wore extravagant kimonos and commanded admiration, their freedom was limited. Some prints and plays hinted at this duality, showing courtesans waiting alone, their painted smiles hiding exhaustion. The floating world glittered, but its brilliance was layered with sorrow. Isn't it haunting how the same lanterns that symbolized pleasure also illuminated confinement? Confucian scholars and officials condemned the floating world as corrupt. They passed edicts to restrict extravagance, tried to ban certain prints, and scolded kabuki for stirring chaos. Yet every time restrictions tightened, the demand grew stronger. Even the word ukiyo reveals this irony. Once a Buddhist term, meaning the sorrowful world of impermanence, it was repurposed to mean the world of fleeting pleasures. People took a warning and twisted it into an invitation. Isn't it ironic how language itself can rebel against its original meaning? Yet for all the criticism, the floating world enriched Japanese culture. Fashion trends born in Yoshiwara spread across cities. Poems written by courtesans influenced literature. Kabuki became a cornerstone of national identity. The woodblock prints so controversial in their time are now displayed in museums across the world as cultural treasures. What was once shocking has become heritage. Doesn't that make you wonder which aspects of our world dismissed as frivolous today will be celebrated as art centuries from now? As you wander out of Yoshiwara in your imagination, the lanterns fading behind you, you carry the echoes of laughter, the rustle of silk kimonos, and the music of shamisen strings. Japan's floating world wasn't about hiding desire. It was about transforming it, turning pleasure into performance, indulgence into art, and fleeting nights into memories, etched forever in woodblock prints. And that is why, even centuries later, the floating world still captivates anyone who steps into its glow. You drift away from Ito's lantern-lit streets, the shamisen notes still echoing faintly in your ears, and suddenly you find yourself thousands of miles away, standing in the vast plazas of the Maya world. Towering stone pyramids rise before you, their steps steep, and their peaks crowned with temples that seem to scrape the sky. Incense drifts in heavy curls, drums pound in relentless rhythm, and rulers clad in resplendent feathered headdresses stride across the stage of ritual. Imagine watching this spectacle unfold and realizing that intimacy itself, woven with bloodletting and sacrifice, was seen as essential to keeping the cosmos alive. Doesn't it leave you astonished to think that a civilization treated the body as a cosmic tool, as much as a personal one? The Maya believed the universe required constant nourishment. Life wasn't automatic. It had to be renewed through ritual blood and symbolic acts of fertility. Their kings and queens weren't just rulers. They were conduits between humans and the divine. During festivals, rulers performed bloodletting ceremonies, piercing tongues, ears, or flesh, to release lifeblood that was burned or offered to the gods. But blood alone wasn't enough. Rituals often combined this sacrifice with dances, feasts, and acts symbolizing creation. For the Maya, the human body was a miniature cosmos, capable of reenacting the very forces that shaped the heavens and the earth. Isn't it fascinating how a culture could see no divide between devotion and physicality, between survival and desire feasts? Added another layer, archaeological evidence reveals cacao drinks mixed with chili honey and fermented beverages creating altered states of consciousness. These intoxicants weren't for recreation. They prepared participants to cross the boundary between the human and the divine. In some ceremonies, couples performed dances that symbolized the fertility of maize, the sacred crop that defined Maya life. The connection between cornfields and human intimacy wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. Just as maize sprouted from earth, people believed fertility rituals encouraged the gods to bless crops' families and the survival of the community. Can you imagine standing in a plaza, watching nobles, dressed as gods, perform, before thousands believing the prosperity of your family depended on their union murals, and carvings give us glimpses? At Bonampak, vibrant paintings show nobles in elaborate costumes, musicians striking rhythms, dancers spinning under torchlight. Some scenes suggest ritual intoxication and celebration that blurred the lines between feasting and sacred performance. Figurines unearthed from sites depict couples in postures that scholars link to fertility rites. Though archaeologists debate whether these acts were literal or symbolic, the repetition across artifacts leaves little doubt that the theme of union, both divine and human, was central to Maya thought. Doesn't it amaze you how societies leave tantalizing hints, but rarely enough to give us certainty politics were inseparable from these ceremonies? A ruler's ability to channel divine power through ritual intimacy was proof of his legitimacy. If the crops flourished after a ceremony, he was affirmed as chosen by the gods. If famine followed, his authority weakened. Imagine being a king, knowing your political survival depended not only on military victories, but on convincing thousands that heaven itself endorsed your rule through dramatic embodied rituals. Doesn't it make you think of modern leaders whose televised ceremonies or parades serve as proof of competence, even if the reality behind the show is less certain? The myths reinforced the worldview. Maya cosmology told of the hero twins who descended into the underworld, faced trials, and re-emerged victorious. Their journey symbolized death and rebirth cycles of creation that the people sought to replicate in ritual. Intimacy mirrored those myths. Union represented the moment the cosmos was reborn, the joining of opposites that created life. To them, every embrace wasn't just personal, it was cosmic theater, replaying the story of the world's beginning. Isn't that a startling thought? That something private in our view was for them the hinge of the universe. Spanish chroniclers arriving centuries later condemned what they saw. Missionaries destroyed idols, burned codices, and branded Maya practices as corruption. To European eyes, shaped by their own moral codes, these ceremonies looked scandalous. But the Maya weren't scandalizing themselves. They were fulfilling duties they believed kept the universe alive. The clash of cultures was brutal. Rituals erased temples, repurposed memory, buried. Yet fragments survived enough for us to glimpse a civilization that embraced what others rejected. Isn't it tragic how conquest silenced voices, leaving us to piece together truth from ruins and ashes? And yet, despite erasure, the Maya vision of the body as sacred vessel lingers. Archaeologists uncover altars, murals, and pottery that still whisper of a worldview where maize blood and intimacy were threads in the same cosmic fabric. Tourists today walk through Chichen Itza or Tikal, marveling at pyramids without realizing that these stones once hosted ceremonies, binding love, sacrifice, and survival into a single act. The shock lies not in what the Maya did, but in how openly they made it part of public life. So you stand in the great plaza in your imagination, drums reverberating in your chest, torches flickering against temple walls, incense thick in the air. The ruler raises his hands, blood flowing, as musicians strike a rhythm and dancers move in patterns symbolizing creation. Couples join in ritual performance, embodying the union of gods and humans. And as you watch, you realize the Maya didn't separate sacred from sensual. To them, the body was not merely flesh. It was maze, rain, cosmos, and continuity. And that truth, carved into murals and whispered through ruins, still echoes long after the last festival flame went out. You step away from the Maya plazas, the smell of incense and cacao still lingering in your imagination, and the world shifts into something even heavier. The sky seems darker, the air charged as though each drumbeat rattles the ground beneath your feet. You're standing in the heart of the Aztec Empire. Before you rise temples with staircases that climb like stone rivers toward the gods. Their steps are stained with centuries of offerings, and the plazas below are so vast that tens of thousands could gather at once. Hook, imagine watching a ritual here where music feasting and even moments of intimacy were deliberately interlaced with the sharp edge of sacrifice, all to keep the sun itself burning in the sky. Doesn't it send a chill down your spine to realize that survival in their eyes demanded both joy and terror? In equal measure, the Aztec worldview was built on cosmic fragility. They believed the universe had been destroyed and reborn multiple times, and that their era, ruled by the fifth sun, could collapse without nourishment. The sun god Tonatiuh required energy from human hearts and blood to rise each day. Without sacrifice, the cosmos would falter. Festivals for gods like Xochiquetzal, goddess of love and fertility, or Xochipilli, patron of flowers and art, reflected this belief. Celebrations began with dancing and garlands of blossoms, where men and women adorned themselves with feathers and masks, their movements blurring the line between devotion and courtship. Imagine the scene: laughter music, perfumes in the air, and all of it leading toward offerings that reminded everyone how fragile life was. Isn't it startling how the Aztecs wrapped cosmic dread inside layers of celebration? Spanish chroniclers, horrified, wrote that these festivals often mixed intoxication with intimacy. Pulque, a fermented agave drink, flowed through the crowds. Revelers danced in processions, and sometimes couples were chosen to perform symbolic unions meant to honor fertility gods. Outsiders called it debauchery. But to the Aztecs, this was balanced joy, and desire stood side by side with fear and sacrifice. Without both, the world could not continue. Can you imagine living with the conviction that your personal happiness was a literal offering to keep the stars in the sky? The mingling of opposites was deliberate. Sacrifice alone might have driven the people into despair. So rituals were wrapped in spectacle music costumes, intimacy turning terror into a shared festival. Drums thundered, flutes wailed, dancers spun, and crowds feasted on maize and cacao. In the middle of it all, rulers ascended pyramids to present offerings. You might compare it to modern festivals, where joy unites communities, except here the climax involved blood and hearts on altars. Doesn't that comparison make you uneasy? Realizing how easily celebration can carry fear at its core, artifacts confirm this blending. The Codex Borgia shows fertility deities paired with symbols of sacrifice, lovers entwined beneath suns rimmed with blood. Stone carvings depict dancers wearing the skins of victims, symbolizing rebirth through death. Figurines found at temples show couples holding maize stalks, linking intimacy with agriculture, suggesting that human union and the growth of crops were inseparable. Isn't it fascinating and unsettling how art can carry both beauty and horror? How the same carving can be blessing and warning at once? Politics pulse through these ceremonies. Emperors staged grand festivals to prove divine favor, reminding subjects that their rulers could keep the sun alive. The greater the spectacle, the stronger the message. Without the emperor, without the gods he served, chaos loomed. When you picture Moctezuma II presiding over a festival in Tenochtitlan, feathers shimmering crowds, roaring, sacrifices offered at the temple peak. You're not just seeing religion, you're seeing statecraft. Doesn't it echo how leaders in every age use public ritual, from parades to televised addresses, to prove their legitimacy? And yet not everyone approved. Within Aztec society itself, there were priests who worried about excess, who warned against indulgence with pulque, who tried to regulate how much joy could accompany sacrifice. The paradox was constant. Too much pleasure could anger the gods. Too little might weaken morale. The balancing act reveals a society aware of its own contradictions, trying to live within cosmic rules that demanded extremes. Isn't it remarkable how even cultures built on certainty wrestled with doubt? When the Spanish arrived, they seized on the most shocking elements. Missionaries described festivals in lurid detail, condemning them as proof of barbarism. They ignored the symbolic depth painting, Aztec rituals as grotesque. Yet fragments of truth remain in the codices, carvings, and oral memory. To the Aztecs, pleasure and pain weren't opposites. They were two sides of one, offering two halves of a single truth, that life demanded sacrifice and joy in equal measure. So you step away from that Aztec plaza in your imagination, the drums still pounding in your chest, the smell of flowers mingling with blood in the air. You realize that for the Aztecs, intimacy was never private. It was public, cosmic, political, and terrifying. They dared to stage ceremonies that united desire and dread, laughter and death in one spectacle so powerful that even centuries later it unsettles us. And perhaps the real shock is not that they did it, but that we, in quieter ways, still do. You leave behind the towering temples of Tenochtitlan, the echo of drums still vibrating in your chest, and suddenly the landscape transforms. Sand replaces jungle, the air grows dry, and in the distance, the Nile wins its way like a silver serpent through the desert. Colossal statues rise with falcon heads and jackal faces gazing sternly from temple walls. Egypt greets you, not with whispers, but with monuments, a land where pyramids pierce the sky and myths breathe life into stone. And yet beneath this aura of timeless order lies something that startles an openness toward intimacy and fertility that was interlaced with religion itself. Imagine walking into a shrine where the gods' own stories revolved around desire, jealousy, and union. Doesn't it feel astonishing that the civilization most famous for solemn tombs and order also carried within it such deeply human passions? Mythology reveals these truths most vividly. The tale of Osiris and Isis, retold for centuries, isn't just about death and resurrection. It is about devotion so strong that Isis, after Osiris's murder and dismemberment by his brother Set, reassembled his scattered body. With magic, she revived him long enough to conceive Horus. That act bound intimacy directly to cosmic renewal. Every time Egyptians retold this myth, they were reminded that life itself flowed from sacred union. Imagine being in a temple while priests recited these words, realizing that divine fertility was the foundation of cosmic order. Doesn't it blur the line between myth and ritual, between love story and theology? The festivals reflected this mindset. Celebrations for Hathor, goddess of music, intoxication, and joy, were noisy, vibrant, and sometimes shocking to outsiders. Men and women danced to the beat of drums, shaking sistrums, metal rattles associated with the goddess. Wine and beer flowed freely, and bawdy songs filled the night air. Devotion wasn't a solemn affair. It was laughter rhythm, and sometimes a blur of pleasure. For Egyptians, joy itself was a sacred act, a way of honoring Hathor. Can you imagine praying not with silence and folded hands, but with dance drink and music under the stars? Even pharaohs tied their rule to fertility. Kings were not only political leaders, but embodiments of cosmic balance. Their virility symbolized the Nile's floods, ensuring crops and prosperity. Some rituals included symbolic unions between the pharaoh and priestesses acting as goddesses, reaffirming his divine role. It wasn't mere theater. It was a statement that the ruler himself stood as the channel of creation. Doesn't it sound like a heavy burden, knowing your personal image was tied to the very survival of your people? Archaeological discoveries give us more intimate glimpses. The Turin erotic papyrus, found in Deir el-Medina, depicts scenes that modern audiences might blush to see. Scholars debate whether it was satirical instructional or ritual art, but its very existence shows that Egyptians recorded intimacy openly. Far from being suppressed, such imagery survived in papyrus ostraca and amulets. Isn't it surprising that a culture so obsessed with order in architecture and law was equally candid in recording the chaos and playfulness of human desire? Everyday life reflected this sacred openness. Amulets, shaped like fertility symbols, prayers inscribed for healthy childbirth, and household charms invoking deities such as Bes, protector of families, filled ordinary homes. Couples prayed for intimacy, not as taboo, but as blessing. Families sought divine help for children, safe pregnancies, and marital harmony. Doesn't it remind you of modern traditions, when people hang charms, wear rings, or repeat phrases for love and fertility, rituals carried quietly across cultures and centuries? Foreign visitors often reacted with shock. Herodotus, the Greek historian, recorded Egyptian customs with fascination and bewilderment, describing festivals that seemed indulgent to outsiders. Later, Greek and Roman writers alternated between admiration and ridicule. For them, Egypt was exotic, its openness unsettling. Yet these accounts, whether exaggerated or not, reinforce that Egyptians did not conceal their practices. To them, devotion wasn't hidden in back rooms. It marched through temple courtyards. Isn't it striking how one culture's norm can become another's scandal? The interplay of death and intimacy is also worth noting. Tomb art often depicted couples seated together, hand in hand, as if to show that love endured beyond the grave. Scenes of banquets with food music and affection accompanied the dead into eternity. To Egyptians, desire wasn't left behind. With the body it traveled with the soul. That belief reveals a startling worldview. Intimacy was not fleeting, but eternal. Doesn't it overturn the assumption that ancient funerary art was purely somber? And so, standing on the banks of the Nile in your imagination, temple walls glowing red in the sunset, you see the paradox clearly. Egypt was a land of monumental order and strict ritual, yet also of laughter, fertility, and human passion. They dared to carve amulets, paint papyri, and celebrate festivals that tied desire to eternity. Their shock lay not in secrecy, but in openness and a willingness to see the body and its pleasures as part of divine balance. And that truth, preserved half in tombs and half in celebrations, proves that even the builders of pyramids knew desire itself could be sacred. You leave the glowing banks of the Nile behind the red sunset, fading from temple walls, and cross northward into the lands once ruled by the Celts and later absorbed by the Romans. Here the air feels colder, the landscapes rougher, and yet beneath the misty hills lie stories just as startling as any carved in stone or painted on papyrus. Imagine standing at a midsummer festival where fire blazes, high drums pound, and men and women leap through flames to ensure fertility for the coming year. Shock comes not from secrecy here, but from wild openness rituals performed under the open sky. Doesn't it surprise you that for people often imagined as fierce warriors, these communities also wove intimacy and fertility into the very cycles of their calendar? The Celtic world tied union to the turning of seasons. Beltane, the great fire festival held at the start of May, was dedicated to fertility crops and renewal. Bonfires were lit, couples leapt through flames, and symbolic unions took place in fields and forests. Accounts from later writers describe how these festivals blurred the lines between devotion, community bonding, and personal desire. To the Celts, intimacy was not a guilty act, but a magical one, essential for ensuring the land's abundance. Imagine the scene fire crackling shadows, dancing on stone circles, laughter mingling with the night wind. Wouldn't you feel both awe and unease watching a community bind love and survival together so publicly? Roman observers often recorded these rituals with both fascination and disdain. Julius Caesar, writing about the Gauls, emphasized their devotion to festivals, their priests, and their gods of fertility and war. Though his lens was political, even hostile, his descriptions reveal a culture where sacred and sensual were deeply entwined. Later, Roman festivals themselves adopted similar themes. The festival of Floralia, for instance, celebrated the goddess Flora with theatrical performances, flowers, and sometimes nudity in public games. Outsiders may have raised eyebrows, but participants saw joy as devotion. Doesn't it make you think of how societies often borrow from one another, adopting what once seemed shocking into the mainstream? Archaeology adds its quiet confirmation. Figurines of fertility, goddesses carved in stone and clay, dot Celtic and Roman sites. Votive offerings show couples embracing prayers for fertility etched beside depictions of grain and animals. In some shrines, symbols of sexuality were offered alongside weapons as though prosperity and survival were inseparable. The imagery suggests that even in societies famed for war, desire was never dismissed. It was honored. Isn't it curious how cultures remembered for conquest also carry gentler rituals that rarely make it into the history books? Christian writers arriving later condemned many of these practices. Church leaders labeled midsummer dances and fertility rites as pagan working to erase them from memory. But echoes survived. Even today, in parts of Europe, festivals like May Day or Midsummer still carry faint traces of older rituals, dancing around maypoles, leaping over bonfires, celebrating fertility of land and family. People no longer call it sacred intimacy, but the gestures linger hidden in plain sight. Doesn't it fascinate you how traditions outlive their original meaning, slipping quietly into new disguises? What strikes you most is the contrast. In Egypt, intimacy was framed by myth and written on papyrus. In Rome, it was staged at banquets and theaters. Among Celts and Romans of Europe, it blazed in firelit fields, performed beneath stars and stone circles. The shock was not in secrecy, but in openness. Rituals lived out before entire communities believed to safeguard harvests and families. As you watch the fire in your imagination, sparks rising into the night, you realize that here, intimacy was not a hidden act, but a public offering to the gods. Couples leapt flames for fertility priests. Blessed unions and whole villages joined in celebrations where laughter and devotion mingled freely. And perhaps that's the most startling part. What seems scandalous now was once the very heartbeat of survival. You leave behind the bonfires of Europe, their sparks still drifting in your mind, and journey south into Africa, where ancient kingdoms flourished with traditions that startled outsiders yet anchored entire societies. The heat here feels different, thicker, and the sound of drums echoes across plains and forests. Imagine stepping into a village gathering where fertility wasn't whispered about in hidden corners, but sung, danced, and performed under moonlight as part of the rhythm of life. For many African cultures, intimacy was never detached from community or spirit. It was woven directly into the ceremonies that honored ancestors and ensured survival. Doesn't it intrigue you that what modern eyes might call shocking was in fact sacred choreography binding generations together? Across sub-Saharan Africa, rites of passage often carried startling elements. Young men and women were initiated into adulthood through ceremonies that blended instruction, song dance, and symbolic acts tied to fertility. These weren't private lessons whispered behind doors. They were public communal events. Elders passed on wisdom about responsibility, family, and union. Masks and costumes embodied spirits, and dances enacted myths of creation. Imagine standing in the middle of such a ceremony, drums beating in your chest, dancers circling fires, chants rising to the night sky. Doesn't it feel like the very earth itself was pulsing with the rhythm of human life? The Kingdom of Benin, famed for its bronze art, left behind plaques showing not just rulers and warriors, but also fertility symbols. Likewise, Nok terracotta figures, some dating back over 2,000 years, depict men and women in intimate poses, perhaps linked to agricultural fertility. Archaeologists debate whether these were religious offerings, teaching tools, or expressions of cultural ideals. But their existence proves that intimacy was not silenced. It was etched in clay and bronze. Isn't it surprising that artifacts of desire survive right alongside weapons and thrones? The rituals often tied the body to the land. In agricultural societies, fertility was more than a personal matter. It was cosmic, ensuring crops, herds, and families thrived together. Ceremonies invoked gods and ancestors, blending physical union with prayers for rain and harvest. Outsiders, especially European colonizers, later condemned these practices as scandalous, branding them as pagan or indecent. But to those who lived them, they were acts of continuity, ensuring the future of the tribe. Isn't it sobering how quickly a worldview can be dismissed when seen through foreign eyes? Music and dance played central roles. In some regions, dances dramatized courtship, fertility, and renewal. Movements were bold rhythms, infectious, and the line between performance and ritual blurred. For participants, these were not spectacles for entertainment, but sacred acts. Anthropologists recorded ceremonies where couples symbolically reenacted creation myths in front of entire communities. The shock lies not in secrecy, but in openness, the willingness to let everyone witness the rituals of life. Doesn't it flip expectations, showing that privacy is not a universal concept, but a cultural invention? Colonial narratives distorted much of this history. Missionaries wrote accounts dripping with judgment, focusing only on what they saw as excess. Yet even in their biased words, glimpses of truth survive communities where fertility rites were joyful, unashamed, and integral to survival. The condemnation says more about the colonizers than the colonized. Today, scholars revisit oral traditions, artifacts, and rituals to recover what was nearly erased. Doesn't it make you wonder how much human history we've lost to the filters of disapproval, and yet echoes persist? In modern Africa, many festivals still celebrate fertility harvest and continuity, though often reinterpreted through new lenses. Drumming dance and masks remain, carrying forward ancient rhythms. Tourists may see them as exotic performances, but locals know they are more than spectacle. They are memory, identity, and survival embodied. So as you step out of that village in your imagination, firelight fading behind you, you carry with you a startling realization. In Africa's ancient kingdoms and tribes, intimacy was not hidden in shame. It was danced, sung, and sculpted into art, a reminder that survival itself was always tied to joy. And that truth, too often dismissed or forgotten, reveals the richness of a worldview, where body and spirit were never enemies but allies. You leave behind the fires of African villages, their drums still echoing in your chest, and step westward into the lands of early Europe once more. This time, not the Celtic fields, but the medieval cities that grew from their ashes. Here, stone walls rise high, monasteries cast long shadows, and the church bells toll above narrow, crowded streets. If the Celts and Africans once danced intimacy in public rituals, medieval Europe tried to hide it behind cloisters and confessionals. Yet no matter how firmly it was suppressed, desire found ways to slip out, sometimes in festivals, sometimes in taverns, sometimes in scandals that shocked entire kingdoms. Imagine wandering through a bustling medieval market, catching whispers of bawdy songs, sung by peasants, even as priests thundered about sin. Doesn't it strike you that the louder society tries to silence something, the more loudly it tends to reappear? The church, determined to impose order, preached restraint. Intimacy was bound to marriage framed as duty rather than delight. Yet folk traditions refused to die. May Day festivals, for instance, survived as echoes of earlier fertility rites. Villagers danced around maypoles, sang songs of renewal, and sometimes slipped into fields or forests for acts that clergy condemned, but communities winked at. Imagine the sight-bright ribbons, streaming couples laughing the earth itself, celebrated as fertile and alive. Doesn't it feel as though ordinary people carried older truths in secret, even when forbidden court life added another dimension? Medieval kings and queens staged marriages as political theater, but scandals erupted when rulers broke their vows. Chronicles recorded affairs, betrayals, and whispered liaisons. Tales of Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, fueled gossip across Europe, her court seen as a place where poetry and passion mingled with politics. Troubadours sang of courtly love, an idealized yet startlingly romantic vision that celebrated longing outside of marriage. Isn't it fascinating that while sermons condemned desire, poetry elevated it as noble art, and literature captured the contradictions? Illuminated manuscripts, often created in monasteries, sometimes hid marginalia, tiny drawings of monks, nuns, and peasants in bawdy scenes. Whether intended as humor or subversion, they reveal that even within the holiest spaces, imagination strayed. At the same time, fabliaux comic tales popular in France mocked priests, lovers, and villagers with stories of trickery and seduction. These tales shocked audiences then, just as they amuse us now. Doesn't it amaze you how humor becomes a safe vessel for truths that society tries to repress? Public festivals carried the tension further. The Feast of Fools, for instance, turned order upside-down. Clergy dressed as jesters. Peasants mocked authority, and boundaries of propriety bent for a day. Beneath the laughter, intimacy often played a role as crowds used the chaos as cover for flirtation and mischief. Imagine the entire town in on the joke, laughing at authority while secretly savoring freedom. Doesn't it feel like the medieval world, far from being purely pious, had built-in pressure valves to release what it tried so hard to contain? Of course, not all was play. The church's obsession with sin fueled witch hunts where women were accused of consorting with demons in imagined nocturnal orgies. These accusations reveal more about fear than fact, but they show how intimacy, when uncontrolled by church doctrine, was demonized. Thousands suffered under these suspicions, proving that suppression could be deadly. Isn't it chilling to realize how quickly desire can be twisted into fear, and fear into violence, and yet, despite the repression, desire remained part of daily life? Taverns, bathhouses, and markets all carried reputations as places where rules loosened. Archaeological remains of communal baths in medieval towns suggest spaces where social and physical closeness blurred. While official sermons thundered ordinary people carved out private and public spaces for the same acts of joy and renewal that their ancestors had danced openly in fields. Doesn't it reveal the resilience of human nature finding ways to survive even under watchful eyes? So as you step out of the medieval streets in your imagination, the bells tolling overhead, you realize that Europe's shock wasn't in its openness, but in its contradictions. Beneath sermons and prohibitions, laughter and desire persisted, sometimes hidden, sometimes bursting into festivals, always refusing to be erased. And that may be the most startling lesson of all. No matter how firmly society tries to suppress it, intimacy always finds a way to reemerge, reminding us that human nature cannot be silenced forever.